Let's take a little trip inside your body. You just ate a bunch of carbohydrates. Now on one hand, some of those carbohydrates will get used for fuel, but on another hand, they may very well turn into fat. It's called de novo lipogenesis, and we're going to talk about what exactly happens when that extra carbohydrate, you don't know where the line is, gets turned into fat. So we sort of have to think of extra carbohydrates or extra glucose as like a hyperactive kid, right? If the kid has a job or he's out running or playing or doing a sport or something, he's fine. But when that kid is not doing that, he's up to no good. He's up to mischief, right? That's kind of the way glucose works. I'm not saying that carbohydrates are bad. There's just a very fine line as to when you overdid it. You see, when we ingest carbohydrates, the first thing that happens is they get broken down into what are called monosaccharides. These monosaccharides are like glucose, fructose, galactose. We're going to leave fructose and galactose off the table right now because what happens is they go to the liver and they get turned into glucose via a different pathway. They can absolutely still contribute to fat accumulation, but we're going to focus on the simplicity of glucose here. Okay, so this glucose then can do a few things. It has a few different fates. Okay, one of the fates is that glucose goes through what's called glycolysis and it gives us energy, creates ATP. It's kind of what we want, right? If we were to eat some carbohydrates before a workout, then yes, we would more than likely use those carbohydrates during a workout. Okay, one of the other fates that it can have is if you don't need energy right at that very point in time, it goes to glycogen storage. You probably have heard of this before. It's sort of like cold storage, right? We take that carbohydrate that we consumed a little too much of and it stores in either the muscle or the liver. But what if those storage forms are full? Or what if just that process is turned off for whatever reason because your rate of glycogen uptake or synthesis is just less? Well, then those carbohydrates can turn into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. Let's dive into what it looks like. The big factor here is insulin. Okay, it's kind of like the big rate limiting or rate initiating step in some ways. Okay, you consume carbohydrates, those glucose molecules do something. They send a signal to the liver, which then sends a signal to the pancreas. And that pancreas then says, oh, okay, I produce insulin. I'm sure you've heard of this before. The insulin goes around through the bloodstream and its sole purpose, its main job is to tell the cell to take in that glucose. Okay, but in the process of doing that, insulin also is what is called anti-lipolytic or lipolytic, potato, meaning it stops the fat burning process from occurring. So you might think, well, I'm not working out, I'm not burning fat. No, you're always having some degree of sort of beta oxidation fat burning occurring. Okay, you always have a balance of fat coming in, fat leaving. So when you turn off the fat leaving aspect for a minute, you are now in what is called a positive fat balance, which means that you have more fat coming in than what is being burned. This in and of itself can cause you to store fat, but it gets a little bit more involved in that. So this insulin has, again, one sole purpose. I mean, it does other things, but it's one sole purpose: get the glucose into the cell. So that means it stops all the other processes in the meantime. All the triglycerides that are stored in the adipocyte, stored in a cell, well, they are normally able to leave and get burned. But insulin says, nope, we're stopping all processes. So all triglycerides stay where you are. Stop. And here's a really cool analogy, okay? This analogy is like dominoes, okay? If you knock over a domino, things fall, right? It goes down the path. Well, normally in a healthy individual, normal process of burning fat goes something like this. Adrenaline, domino number 1, binds to a receptor on the cell, which activates something called cyclic adenosine monophosphate, the next domino, which activates something called protein kinase A, the next domino, okay, which therefore activates something called hormone-sensitive lipase, the next domino. Then, after hormone-sensitive lipase is activated, it sort of acts like scissors, and it cuts the fatty acid that's stored into the cell, and it cuts it free so it can go into the bloodstream. Those scissors are very important. So those dominoes, boom, 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 are so important. So here's what happens once those carbohydrates are consumed. Okay, you now have something called protein kinase B that takes that cyclic adenosine monophosphate domino and pulls it out. So now instead of boom, 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 boom down the line to burn fat, you have boom. And then the rest of the dominoes are like, what's going on? We're not getting knocked over because you removed that rate limiting step. So insulin stops that fat burning process in its tracks. But now let's talk about how those carbohydrates literally get turned into new fat. Because this is where it's very important, because sure, we stopped the fat burning effect, which is not good, but what about turning into new fat? Well, here's what it looks like. Remember, carbohydrates are the hyperactive child. If we're not using them, they're going to do something, right? So remember that fat is stored in the form of triglycerides. Okay, so triglycerides are the storage form of fat, and what they are 3 fatty acids bound to a glycerol head, triglyceride, okay? So we have to create a glycerol, and we have to create 3 fatty acids from thin air out of carbohydrates. Well, it's a complicated process, but here's what ends up happening. So first we need to form glycerol. Well, when glucose goes through glycolysis, one of the byproducts is actually glycerol. There's something called glycerol dehydrogenase that through the whole process of glycolysis, glycerol is actually created. So believe it or not, glycerol is not the difficult part. That's a molecule that is created out of thin air relatively seamlessly in our body. So we have a lot of spare glycerol around. But it gets a little more complicated when you have the fatty acids. How do we create literal fatty acids out of a carbohydrate? Well, after glycolysis, ATP is formed, the energy currency, but also something called pyruvate, which you might remember from like sophomore biology class, right? But we're not going to focus on the action of pyruvate. But essentially what happens is that pyruvate goes and it gets turned into something called acetyl coenzyme A. So then you have this acetyl coenzyme A, right? Well, then you have another thing that's called acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase. What happens is that acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase combines with the coenzyme A, acetyl coenzyme A, and it turns it into what's called malonyl coenzyme A. Okay, you getting lost yet? So then you have acetyl coenzyme A that binds with malonyl coenzyme A, as well as one other third party called 1,4-NADPH. Those all combine, and then they combine with something called fatty acid synthase to create a couple of carbon chains. Like, is your brain melting as much as mine is? Okay. Then it repeats this process over and over and over again until it forms a 16 carbon length chain, palmitic acid. It basically forms a saturated fat. Palmitic acid, I talk about that in other videos. Palmitic acid in a dietary form is good. So it creates palmitic acid. It creates a saturated fat. Though what's interesting is that fat that is formed from carbohydrates actually takes a slightly different form than other fat. Researchers can look at a body, especially in the liver, and see if fat has come from de novo lipogenesis via its palmitic acid saturated form or from something else, or from like fatty acid flux, which we'll talk about in a second. I'm going to talk about the fatty liver now because this is a very important aspect on how carbohydrates can contribute to a fatty liver. Let me go ahead and say something very important here. If you haven't already, please do start swapping some of your snacks out from carbohydrate snacks to maybe more fat-oriented snacks or protein-oriented snacks, okay? When you need to have a snack, please abstain from the carbohydrates. Have something with some protein in it. Have a beef stick, have a turkey jerky stick, something like that. I put a link down below for the grocery store that I use online. It's called Thrive Market. I've got 2 kids. I don't have time to always go to the grocery store, but if I am craving something, I can go online to Thrive Market and I can order what I want, like what I want to stock my pantry with, what I want to stock my fridge with, and then it's at my doorstep in a couple of days. For someone that is busy, I am telling you, it is a game changer. It is 100% something that has changed my world entirely in terms of how I shop. They are today's video sponsor, and there is an awesome link down below that'll save you 25% off your first grocery store order with them. Okay, then you also get a free gift. So that gets delivered right to your doorstep. Definitely has the Tom Stillhauer stamp of approval. Almost every single food item that Thrive Market has been vetted by industry experts, and they make sure that they're really bringing good food for people to make good choices. So you can sort by different diet type. So that link down below to save 25% off, and a big thank you to them, because without them, none of this would be possible. Now, it's very important that I note that just simply going out and eating a carbohydrate isn't going to magically have it turn into fat, right? There are lots of different hormonal things at play. There's activity things at play. There's catecholamine things at play. We don't even know where it begins, okay? So who's to say that right now I could go eat a banana and it would store as fat versus I could eat a banana and it would get incinerated and give me energy, right? There's so much that we don't know, and I'm not going to pretend that researchers know everything that's going on. But we do know some of these things that we can see with like epidemiological data and with observational studies and with some in vitro stuff. And we have to compile all that data, and that's how we get roughly an idea of how things work. Someone that I respect in the industry that I know doesn't always agree with what I say is someone named Lane Norton, and I wanted to mention, like, I love what he said. He said when he steps on stage, like he's, you know, nutrition science PhD, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He drops a pen on the floor, and he says, hey, how about that? Gravity worked again, but that doesn't mean that it's always going to work. So we all assume gravity is always going to work, right? But it's not proven. It's always a theory, right? That's the way science is. Nothing is proven. You don't hear researchers say it's proven, right? You might say demonstrated, or things like. So all of this stuff, although very complex, and although we seem to have a very solid idea, we cannot say 100% that if you go overeat on cake, this is 100% going to happen, okay? Because everybody is different, and the microbiome plays a huge role in how we metabolize glucose. But one of the things that I think is very important to talk about where there's a little bit more evidence is with a fatty liver, okay? So a fatty liver is where your liver stores fat. Now remember this whole process I talked about with de novo lipogenesis happening in an adipocyte where we create fat. Well, a hepatocyte, a liver cell, can actually do this on its own. It can create its own fat within itself, i.e. fatty liver. In fact, if you look at the metabolic conditions related to a fatty liver, you see that there is an increase in de novo lipogenesis. So people that have higher rates of fatty liver tend to have higher rates of de novo lipogenesis. So correlation doesn't equal causation, but we can start to connect the dots. Then when you look at the fat content of a fatty liver, they tend to see that, oh, well, fatty liver seems to be more saturated fat. Well, guess what? Saturated fat, palmitic acid, is the saturated fat that is formed from de novo lipogenesis. Again, correlation doesn't equal causation, but another thing that makes you go, okay, if the saturated fat is the kind of fat that's in the liver, and the saturated fat is what's typically formed via de novo lipogenesis, that kind of starts to add up. But researchers have been able to look at a liver and they see that the triglycerides that end up in the liver generally come from about 26% de novo lipogenesis triglycerides, meaning about 26% of the fat that ends up building in the liver during a fatty liver seems to come from this whole overconsumption of carbohydrates, turning them into triglycerides via de novo lipogenesis, via the process I had explained before, okay? But it still kind of continues. They also see that 59% of the fat that is accumulated in the liver comes from what is called fatty acid flux. Now that fatty acid flux could certainly come from overconsumption of saturated fats. It could certainly come from overconsumption of fats. But one of the possible theories is that this fatty acid flux would definitely be playing a role if fatty acids were surging in the bloodstream as a result of de novo lipogenesis from excess carbohydrate consumption. So think about it. You consume too many carbohydrates, so suddenly you have higher levels of triglycerides in the blood, okay, and those triglycerides then go to the liver and they store in the liver. But 26% of the fat that's stored in the liver is also coming from the hepatocytes creating their own fat. Now we're starting to see some evidence that a fatty liver could be a stronger predictor of cardiovascular disease than even metabolic syndrome. Okay. And then there's some interesting data published in a study in diabetes care that demonstrated that in people that had a fatty liver, there was an 85% incidence rate of type 2 diabetes versus 30% in control. Okay. Type 2 diabetes, obviously inability to really deal with carbohydrates right. Is it just a coincidence that we see, oh, there's more fatty liver in type 2 diabetics and vice versa than in healthy individuals? If they're unable to deal with the carbohydrates, then the carbohydrates have a higher chance of getting converted into fat because they are running amok, right? They're causing chaos. So I have to be very, very candid when I say we don't know the entire picture, but this is a little trip through the body of how this works, and you can make decisions that are practical. If you're going to be active, that's a better time to have the carbohydrates. If you know you're going to be sitting down and not using those carbohydrates, maybe that's a better time to go for more of a protein or a fat-based snack, and it might make more sense for you there. So again, if you need ideas with that, Thrive Market's perfect for that. But as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.